Hello and welcome to the next video. In this video, we'll talk about networking with Ktor. My name is Per-Erik. If you like my videos, please like, share, and subscribe. As the previous videos, this is a short video or semi-short video about Kotlin Multiplatform and making sure that people can see it's not that different from regular Android developer. So let's look at what we're going to do today. I already have a small application, very similar to the previous one with SQLite. It's just a list of posts, and in this video we will convert this in-memory repository into a network repository. So let's get started. The first thing, of course, we need to add the dependencies and a plugin for this to work. So let's start by adding the Ktor version, and then we need to add the libraries. Going into the Gradle build file inside the Compose application, we will have to start by adding the plugin at the top. This is to help us with the serialization. And then, of course, we need to add the different dependencies to the different targets. For Android main, we need the OK HTTP. For the common main, we have a few other things, and we also need to add for iOS that uses a Darwin client, and of course also for main that works with Java, the desktop main. Don't forget that in Android we also need to add a permission to the manifest so that we have permission to use internet. We will be using a placeholder API where we have some posts. You can get a list of items. You can also ask for one specific item. And this is what we will start with to create the data transfer objects and do some mapping between the domain object and the data transfer object. So let's create the post dto.kt, create a class. It should be a data class, so let's change it. And then we add the properties that we had from the API. Let's move on to the mapper files, post.ext extension functions. We have two extension functions. The first one is to map the post DTO to a regular post. And the second one is to map the post DTO, the post into a post DTO. Now we can start working on the data sources. So let's create a post data source. Let's start with an interface and define the functions that we want to have. I will create quite a few functions here. It's mainly so that you will see the different methods. But we will only use one of them in the application to show the post. And now let's create a driver factory so that we can create and get the HTTP client for the different targets. The good thing is that most of this is part of the libraries. We don't have to have any expected actual in when it comes to the networking. There are a few things that we will do when we set up this client. The first thing we can do is to set up some negation. Basically, this means that in this case we will add JSON, which means that we will automatically parse with JSON all the requests we get. And we want it to be pretty print so we can read it easier, and we make it lenient so it doesn't break just because we are missing some minor syntax in the JSON. We also can add generic headers here, or default headers, that will be part of every single call that we're doing. I will also show a little bit later on how to add specific headers for each call. We can also install logging so that we can get some logs going. We have to provide an implementation of an interface. It's fairly straightforward. Inside this object, you can then route this logging to whatever logging framework that you prefer to have in your project. For this case, we just do a print out on the message. We can also set the logging level. In this case, let's log everything. We can filter the logging. And in this case, we just want to log the requests where the URL contains the JSON placeholder APIs. In this case, we just want to log the URLs that contains JSON placeholders. And we can also sanitize the headers to get rid of sensitive information. In this case, we make sure that if the header is the authentication or authentication. In this case, we make sure that if the header is authentication, we don't log it. We just remove it. Now let's create the implementation of the data source. Let's start by implementing an interface for the post data source. And of course, we also need a HTTP client to be passed into the constructor. We can also have the base URL inside there. There are different ways to store it, but for this example, let's just keep it here. Okay, let's implement the get all functions first. Let's change the return to be a flow. Not change, but let's implement it. We add a try catch surrounding everything, just so we are sure we can handle it. if we find an exception, we just, in this case, we just throw it up one level. We will handle the actual exception in the repository later on. Now to actually get all the posts, we have the client. So let's create a request. And here in the get method, you can add headers. Like I mentioned before, these headers can be specific for this call. But of course, if you have the same headers here as in the default setup, you don't need to set up. This is just for visualization that we can do it. Of course, we also need to specify the URL. We can set the protocol. In this case, we have HTTPS. We also need to specify the host, which is the base URL. And then finally, the path, which would be, in this case, posts. Now we can check if the response is, now we can check if the response was successful. If it's not successful, we can just throw an exception. If it was successful, just return the body and it will be parsed to JSON automatically, or parsed to an object from JSON. Let's also implement one more, get by ID. But before we do that, this will be a little bit of a pro tip. You can create an extension function to the HTTP request builder. We can call it common headers. Inside this one, we can move the headers block, and then we can use these functions instead, making it a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier to read. Now let's create the get by ID. For the rest, I will just paste them in, and you can look at them in the repository. Link is in the description. Now when we have implemented the data source, we can implement the repository. Post repository Ktor.kt. Let's create a class. We want to send in the data source. And of course implement the interface. And to implement the fetch all function, We'll use a flow and emit some values. Let's rename the data source a little bit. Let's call getAll. We catch the potential error and then we collect the value. So we want to emit an error. Of course, you should be a little bit more granular with the error than I am. Define the errors you need for your project. And then in collect, let's return the result as a success. We need to map all the DTOs we get to a list of domain objects. We can do that with just a simple map function and call our toPost function. Let's move on to the next function, fetch by ID. We take the data source and call get by ID and send in the ID. Catch the potential exceptions and collect the result. Let's convert this ID to a long directly. Remember that we need to update it in the repository and also in the in-memory repository as well. We can emit error. As I mentioned earlier, be a little bit more granular than I have been here. This is mainly for a visualization purpose to see that this is how we can do it. In this case, we only want to return one domain object. So the only thing we need to do is to take that single DTO and convert it to a post, and then we are done. Pro tip is that we can already see that these are quite similar. So we can make a little bit of an helper function. So let's create an private inline function to help us make it a little bit easier. We can now use our fetch result function. We just have to fill in the two lambdas, first fetch and then transform. So we can now do that for the rest of the functions as well. And there we go. The repository is implemented. Now let's go to the dependency injection and change so that we're using our new repository instead of the in-memory one. We know it takes a data source, so let's create the data source. And we also need a HTTP client for the data source set. So let's create the factory and create it for us. Now we should be able to run again. Let's start with desktop and see how it looks like. Now you can see we have different posts here. This is just some template strings for the iOS. We also get it with these new strings, and for Android we just got it as well. So thank you for watching. If you liked it, make sure to like, subscribe, and share my videos. If you have any topics you want me to go over, mention them in the comments, and I see you in the next video. Happy coding!